Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. It's December 1st, 2019, and you're listening to the Storyteller's Thread. If you're a regular listener, it's good to see you and welcome back. And if you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome and thank you for being here. This month I'm talking with award-winning children's picture book author Lita Judge. As you'll soon hear, Judge's journey into writing for young readers is relatively untraditional. Prior to pursuing a career in children's publishing, she worked for several years as a geologist. But after attending her first art exhibit, she was inspired to quit her job and pursue a career making art. Judge is the author of more than 20 fiction and nonfiction books for young readers, including Born in the Wild, Red Sled, and Hoot and Peep. Her picture book Flight School, which is the story of a plucky little penguin bent on learning to fly, has been adapted into an off-Broadway musical that was staged in New York City as well as China. In 2018, Judge published Mary's Monster, Love, Madness, and How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein. A biography of Mary Shelley, Mary's Monster takes the form of a novel and combines free verse with absolutely gorgeous black and white watercolor illustrations. Booklist has described Mary's Monster as an impeccably researched portrait of a remarkable woman and her literary progeny, and the bulletin of the Center for Children's Books called it a godsend for high school, and I'd add college students, approaching the romantics with skepticism. Mary's Monster was nominated for the 2019 Seelip Carnegie Medal, as well as the Kate Greenaway Medal, the United Kingdom's oldest and most prestigious children's book awards. And it was featured on the Amelia Bloomer book list, which recognizes well-written and well-illustrated books with significant feminist content. It was also shortlisted for the 2019 United Kingdom Literacy Association's Book Award. When I began this podcast, my goal was to create a space in which authors for young adults could talk at length about art, creativity, and their creative process. I think my conversation with Lita about Mary's Monster may be the closest I've come to realizing that vision to date. I hope you enjoy it. By conventional standards, you've lived what I suspect people would probably agree is a rather unconventional life. And my understanding is that you were born on an island in Alaska and that you spent time there as a child with your parents growing up. Is that correct?
Yes, my background is unconventional, I would say. We lived in very remote areas, starting in Alaska, and my dad was a soil scientist, so we needed to live in places that he was mapping soils, so we were living in places that had been unmapped. It meant we lived in the wilds, and when we did go to the mainland, we visited my grandparents who raised eagles and worked with birds of prey, and they were ornithologists, and they lived in a house without running water or electricity when I was little, so I thought we were going to normal when we went to the mainland to visit them, but I realized that growing up in nature has been deeply influencing my work, and I'm thankful for it. Though as a child, it was a pretty isolated existence, and I credit it a lot for why I became a writer, because I think living in the woods, I was forced to kind of live in my head a lot. I became a keen observer because we were working with wildlife a lot, and that helped me become an artist. But more importantly, I think I really had to imagine my imaginary friends and make up stories in my head to keep myself entertained. And so much of my childhood is wrapped up in my work now.
You mentioned your grandmother, and your connection to nature and the land seems to have been further deepened by your relationship with her. I wonder if you could talk about her and the work that she did with raptors and the influences she had on you.
Yes, she was an extraordinary woman, and I really credit her with forming the person, the artist that I am. She was devoted and passionate towards her work in an era when, as a woman, she faced countless obstacles. So she really taught me to be driven and passionate. She was also incredibly connected to the land. She lived in a way that people just don't live nowadays. She rarely wore shoes. She lived in this abandoned farmhouse. My grandparents moved in the 30s, and they moved into this abandoned farmhouse because it was located in the middle of the Buena Vista Marsh. And they spent the rest of their life trying to preserve prairie chickens from going extinct and helping their research help to ban DDT. And then my grandmother also on the side was working with raptors and working to breed eagles in captivity. And I remember lying in bed early in the morning and hearing her eagle call and hearing my grandmother get up and go out and tend to her eagle. She also expected us to get up in the wee hours of the morning. We never got up after the sun. We always got up around 4 o'clock in the morning, went out on the marsh, banded hawks. She taught me how to be an observer for the natural world, but also how to invest in a life that was deeply connected to the earth. And so many of my stories have been informed by that. But also, I think my work ethic has been informed by her, just, with complete devotion. She taught me that though you make a lot of sacrifices living like that, it can be a really satisfying, rewarding life. And I think one of the reasons I love being a creator is I love feeling a really deep connection to my work and kind of being all in, just being completely devoted to it. And I don't know if I would have learned that without my grandmother.
You've said, Lita, that writing books for children was a lifelong dream. Do you remember when that dream first presented itself to you and what inspired it?
It's kind of a dream that has always been a part of you even before you could fully articulate it. But as a young child, I remember being out in the middle of the woods and being surrounded with my imaginary friends. And that was what gave me a sense of connection and a sense of community, a sense of belonging to a place, because, it's not easy to grow up in a place where we were not only far from town, but we were constantly moving. So even if we did meet somebody, within a couple of months, we were in another location. And I think that, I always carried a creative heart inside. I didn't have a lot of exposure to art as a youngster. So though I was growing up to be a creator, I wasn't visualizing how I could put that into children's books. I went and got a degree as a geologist. I worked on dinosaur digs because I was surrounded with scientists. My father was a scientist, my grandparents were scientists. And so I hadn't really fully visualized how to go about putting these emotions, down on paper until I met my husband. And on our first Christmas, he took me to New York and we went to the Met. And there was a show of Renaissance drawings at the Met, and I actually burst into tears. I just was so overcome by this sense that somebody had taken what was in their heart and put it down on paper. And even more beyond that, they had made a life of that. They had, made a career of it. And I suddenly realized I felt behind. I felt like I'd been missing this opportunity. I now realize I don't think I was missing on anything because I think all my experiences were leading up to that point. But on that day, I promised myself that I was going to become an artist. I went home after that trip. I quit my job as a geologist and immediately started drawing every day, all day long, with this goal in mind of writing and illustrating children's books eventually.
That's an amazing story. And I know the feeling that you're describing. I can think of times sitting in a theater and watching a performance and just being moved by the fact that somebody else's words and somebody else's imaginings are moving me.
Yes.
So profoundly, so that totally resonates with me. I wanted to begin our conversation by asking you those questions about your biography because, and you've mentioned this a few times now, my sense is that many of the stories that you tell as a picture book author are shaped by your formative experiences as a young person growing up.
Absolutely. My nonfiction is shaped by the fact that I spent my young childhood observing wildlife in the field, banding hawks, working intimately connected with wildlife. Also, I was a geologist. I worked on dinosaur digs. So I've done nonfiction books about dinosaurs. But my fiction stories, a lot of people may not recognize it immediately, but if you look at the fictional stories I've created, they're also very connected to my childhood. My first fictional story is called Red Sled, and it's this wild romp through the woods with a bear steals a sled, and pretty soon there's more creatures. But if you go back and look at the book, there's a child that lives in a cabin who brings a sled in, and then the adventure with the wildlife unfolds. And at the very end, the child is on the sled with the animals. And that story was formed in my mind when I was a little girl. It took me 30 years to put it down on paper, but all of my fictional stories were stories I carried in my heart. And even now I'm writing stories. They may not be direct, like in that case, it was a plot that I formed when I was a child. Now I'm mostly writing about emotions, what it's like to live out in the woods and to be both intimately connected with nature, but also kind of isolated in that yearning for connection. And those are emotions that I constantly return to when I write for children, because I think, a lot of children are looking for connection, looking for understanding. And those are all things that my childhood gave me.
There's a simplicity to picture books that I think can be deceiving. Compared to a prose novel, I imagine that a picture book's brevity and its minimalist use of text could lead some people to think, hey, provided I have drawing ability, I can do something like that. But that's obviously not the case. From a creator's perspective, can you talk about some of the challenges that are involved in presenting a story in picture book form that the average person might not necessarily consider?
Yes, I love picture books because they're so simple on the surface. And then as a creator, they're so complex and so deep, and they give you so much to chew on and to work on. The most remarkable thing I think about a picture book, as opposed to any other genre, is it is a genre that has to both be relevant and important to a youngster, sometimes they're pre-literate, sometimes, they're just learning to embrace literacy. And then also, if it's a great picture book, it needs to be relevant to the mother or the teacher or the grandparent, the adult that's in the room. And that's not an easy thing to do, to bridge, up to 90 years of age and lifetime experience. So that's a remarkable thing. I think the other thing that this genre has to do is that picture books are read very differently than a novel. A novel we may return to a couple times in our lifetime, but a picture book is something that a child, they absorb to the point it almost becomes a part of them. They read it every night. It becomes a ritual to their life, and it becomes a gateway to understanding the world and how they fit in it and all the emotions they're experiencing. And as an artist, I just feel continually renewed working on that, because it's a pretty exciting thing to be involved in that formation. You're working with a young reader, you're working with a young life. They don't have a lot of experience in the world, but they have a lot of questions, and your job is to kind of make sense of things for them. And hopefully you do it in a joyful manner or a compassionate manner. And all those things make a picture book so complex. And there's also so much of the story that has to be told in the pictures rather than the words, because children at that very young age have a greater visual understanding than they do understanding the written word. And as a visual creator, to me, that's incredibly exciting, because you can bring in emotions and understanding through the characters, through their body language, the set you create, how the characters move through that set, and how the page turns are set up. And it's just endlessly exciting and interesting to create that world where hopefully, if you've done your job well, a 2-year-old and perhaps their grandfather are sitting every night absorbing that story, and little by little that story becomes a part of them.
I love that you're moving our conversation into the creative process, because I'm really fascinated by how different creators approach this work. So what does your creative process entail? Could you walk me through some of the decisions that you have to make as a creator in the process of shepherding a book from its initial conceit through its final production?
Yes, I love talking creative process because, it's just so much a part of what I do. I work probably differently than a lot of writers that you've talked to, or I know when I'm with writers, I always feel a little bit, my approach is very visual. For one thing, I'm dyslexic, and As a child, that was kind of seen as a disadvantage. When I started going to a conventional school and you get this label of being dyslexic, it seems a daunting task to be somebody who's also dreaming of being a writer. But now I realize I think it was as much of an advantage as it was as a disadvantage, because stories unfold to me visually in a way that are just incredibly specific. I see the characters and I see the settings and I see the emotions. And before I ever start with words, I draw and draw and draw, and I get these characters down on paper. Sometimes it starts with an emotion and it's this ethereal feeling that you want to create. But pretty quickly, those characters will start dancing around in my mind. And my job is basically just to get those characters down on paper. And rather than working at a typewriter, I work at a storyboard. So I have several 4 by 8 foot bulletin boards in my studio. And I just start with really rough sketches, pretty much trying to keep up with all the things that are going on in my mind and getting those down on paper and moving them around on the storyboard, and then slowly refining those drawings. And it's quite a ways into the process before I start worrying about the words, because I just want to get down the heart of the story first. And even with, Mary's Monster, that was a long novel, I still work that way. For me, the knowledge and the truth of the story come to me visually before words. And if I've done my job well with the visual part, the words are just sort of there, and it's almost like recognizing them rather than, I guess more of the searching process is in the visual part for me. And I think I work that way both because my mind is kind of wired that way, and also I just enjoy sitting there with a pencil, seeing my characters take shape. It's a way that I get that creative flow where time disappears and it's just between you and the story.
You mentioned Mary's Monster, and I'd like to shift gears here, if you don't mind, and spend the rest of the time we have talking together about that book, which Roaring Book Press published this past year in 2018. Before we do, though, would you mind giving listeners who haven't read Mary's Monster a sense of what the book's about, as well as the form that it takes?
Yes, Mary's Monster is about Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. And when I read Frankenstein again as an adult, I had read it as a youngster, and I loved the book, but I didn't absorb it in the same way as I had read it as an adult. And when I read it as an adult, I was not only struck by the novel itself, but I was really struck by the fact that the author of Frankenstein was a teenage girl. And when I did a tiny bit of research, I realized she was a pregnant runaway. And I was so bowled over by, how this incredible young woman who faced countless obstacles was able to write one of the most influential books of all time. It really gave me the desire to write her story. For one thing, she was forced to publish her book anonymously because she was a young woman. Going into reading Frankenstein, I knew nothing other than the fact that she was a woman, and I was so shocked at her personal journey and the parallels between her story and Frankenstein. And I felt like all of us have kind of been deprived of her story because of the fact she, had to write her book anonymously. So I really set out to write, it's not just a straight up biography. I really wanted to focus on the creative journey that she took and that entailed writing Frankenstein. So it's not a birth to death biography. It starts when she's 14 and it ends about 5 years after she created Frankenstein. And it really carries her through the journey of how she came to write this incredible book. And the format of my book is a illustrated novel in verse. So it's not a graphic novel where you have celled out several images on a page. It's every page is a full bleed spread like you would see in a picture book. And then every page is a poem. And the reason I chose that format was I'm a visual storyteller. I knew I had to do this visually. And I also felt that this young woman who had been really deprived of her identity as an author, I wanted as a creator to know the visual part of the story as well as the words. To me, I guess because I absorb stories visually, it was essential to create it that way. I didn't want to do a graphic novel because I felt like the format didn't fit. Her story is just so viscerally emotional. She suffered countless obstacles and mental abuse by both her father and her mother-in-law, and also by the married poet that she fell in love with, Percy Shelley. And she turned all of those obstacles and that suffering into her creative work. And I wanted to see that on the page. So I wanted the full bleed, impact that you get from one image on a page. So the artwork also is much more realistic than you would see if you were to do a graphic novel. And I wanted poems in verse because she married Percy Shelley. She fell in love with this poet. Poetry was a huge part of her life. And I felt like it would kind of nod to the influences in her life if I wrote it in free verse as opposed to prose.
I have to tell you, and I got to tell people who are listening to our conversation, this is a phenomenal book.
Thank you.
I don't think it's possible to read your book and walk away having not been affected by the experience. I really mean that. When I finished Mary's Monster, I had to sit quietly for a while, literally just sorting out my emotional response to her story. And days after I had read it, I continued to find myself thinking about her story. And I attribute that to your ability to put such a human face on Mary Shelley and the people in her life. And I'm curious, what were your own views toward Shelley starting out, and how, if at all, did your feelings as a creator change toward your subject over the course of working on the book?
Yeah, it was an incredibly intense experience.
I would think.
Yes, it was. It took me 6 years to create the book. And I'll be honest, when I started the book, I was very ill. I went through a period in my life where I was not able to create for about 18 months because of I have a autoimmune condition that was not diagnosed in the beginning, and I had lost the use of my hands and eyes. And so when I listened to Frankenstein, I had to listen to the book because I couldn't actually read books. I couldn't create books. And when I listened to Frankenstein, the first time I read the book, the story itself was what compelled me. But the second time I read the book, it was the girl behind the story that was just reaching out with this strength and power. And when I, eventually regained my health and started working on the book, in the beginning, I experienced a lot of rage because Mary herself was just so abused by her father had raised her to believe that she could be more than just a shopkeeper, that she deserved an education, she deserved a voice. Her mother was the founder of feminism who, unfortunately died giving birth to her. So she had this huge legacy that she inherited, and she was burdened by that legacy and really had these huge expectations put on her shoulder. And then at the same time, her father was kind of taking that away from her. And then she falls in love with this poet, Percy Shelley, who believed in her and believed that she should have a voice. And that was incredibly powerful for her. But then at the same time, he was emotionally, I think he was mentally ill, and he really treated her terribly. So when I first started working on the story, I think I felt this deep connection to Mary. And I had to kind of come to terms with all the rage I was feeling, both by her suffering and also as a young woman myself, having been deprived the knowledge of this young woman. I remember in high school reading, the lexicon of classical books, but they were all by men. And here's this incredible novel. And I know they do teach this book in a lot of high schools. My high school did not read this book. And I just felt like, why doesn't every young woman know this woman's story? And I was so enraged by the fact that she had to write the book anonymously. As I worked through the story, I kind of worked through those emotions. And then it kind of became a love affair, to be honest, with this woman. She just filled me up with so much strength and so much as a creator. I mean, I don't think I'll ever have a book like that where I felt such a deep connection to the character of the story. And she just gave me so much because of what she left behind for all of us. And that it was 6 years of drawing and writing every day, to the point of exhaustion, getting up and doing it the next day. And I rarely felt that people, when I finished the book, so many who were close to me thought I should be relieved. And I was actually gutted. It was so powerful to be in her presence for that time, and so rewarding and satisfying. And I just felt this, deep connection. And I think Mary, she left the ability for all of us to connect to her story, because her story, it focuses on isolation and, what happens when a person is so isolated and mistreated. And in the end, it's an incredibly compassionate story. So it was an amazing experience to be creating in her wake. I feel very fortunate to have spent that time working so closely with her, even though she's been gone for 200 years. If you're working with her story, you do feel a deep connection to her.
And I think that's true of the book. I think you articulated something I felt as I read it, which is in a way that the distance between the creator and the subject that they're focusing on does sort of slip away in that book. And there is a sense, I know what you mean when you say it's a love of sorts that's driving the work. Your book is incredibly well researched. In addition to an essay that examines the influences of Shelley's novel in the end matter, you also include a bibliography, a section where you present key works that the principal players in Shelley's life would have been reading and that would have influenced them. You have endnotes directing readers to the primary documents that shaped your presentation of Mary's story. Can you walk me through how you approached researching her life and maybe what that process entailed?
Yeah, it was very important to me to try to get this as right as I could. I felt whenever you're writing about a historical character, you feel the burden of getting it right. And so I kind of wanted to embody her life as much as I could. When I had read Frankenstein, briefly searched online and found out, my goodness, she was 19, and then did a little more digging and realized, pieced together her life and realized she was pregnant while she was writing this story. She was unmarried. She was cast out of her home for being pregnant to a married man. And I immediately had to know more. And we're fortunate that Mary herself left a lot of historical records. She and her then boyfriend, who they eventually were able to marry, but Percy Shelley, kept a diary. When they ran away, 6 weeks after they met, they walked across France, headed to Switzerland, where they were kind of hoping to set up this utopic society where people could live the life they felt they were meant to live and have the freedom to speak the truths that they felt. And during that time, they kept a journal, and they also wrote letters home. And even though her relationship with her father was very estranged in person, they kept in touch with letters, partly because her father was basically extorting money from Percy Shelley. He was at risk of going to debtor's prison, and Percy Shelley was an affluent young man and had promised Mary's father funds to keep him out of prison. Unfortunately, the reality was that Percy's father cut him off from his money. So the young couple was really struggling to make ends meet, and all the time her father is writing letters asking for money. And she's writing letters to him. She's also writing letters to the sister she left behind, Fanny, which is a remarkable relationship because these two young women shared this deep bond. They were both raised to be educated and to believe that they had this legacy of their mothers, this mother that had died giving birth to Mary. So they had this really, really strong bond, but then eventually Mary had decided to elope with Percy and run away, and Fanny was left to be completely isolated and despairing to the point where she eventually committed suicide. But while she was alive, the young women exchanged letters. So I had access to the letters, the diary. I had access to the rough draft, which was fascinating. We got permission to go to the Bodleian Library, where many of these things are housed, and to see the actual documents. And one of the things that I loved getting access to was the rough draft of Frankenstein, because when Mary first published the book, she was forced to publish it anonymously. Nobody expected a woman had written that book. There was a lot of speculation as to who had written it. When her identity was revealed by Lord Byron, people couldn't believe that she had written it, and they said a lot of people implied that Shelley would have had a stronger influence on her writing and that it was coming from Shelley. And the thing that's so amazing on the rough draft is that Mary has her draft and Shelley would offer editorial comments, and his language was always much more flowery and extensive. And in most cases, Mary would cross it out and go back to her original form. And it's amazing because you can really see, like, this is a woman who had a really strong self-identity and knew what she was doing. And in fact, the truth is that Percy died long before he was acknowledged as the great poet that he was. And she edited his work and had much to do with it getting published. So it was really helpful for me to understand her inner strength. In the modern era, it is hard to understand why a young woman would stay with a man who was so abusive to her. But when you look at her letters and her diary, you start understanding that she wanted the freedom to be an author. She wanted the freedom to express her truths. And Percy gave her that, in that he respected her opinions. And despite all the agony that he put her through, you can see that strength and that dream that she had, that she could be a part of forming a world that would be different for women for generations to come. And that's what really came through for me when I was reading these original sources.
There's a note toward the end of your book where you write of Shelley, and I'm going to quote you. It's a testament to a resilient girl whose imagination, forged by isolation, persecution, and loss, created a new form of storytelling as a means of connecting with the very society that had socially exiled her. Can you say more about how you understand that to have been the case?
Yes, she was a remarkable woman in that, I mentioned in the beginning I had all this rage. For a good year, I was just so enraged at how Percy had treated her, how her father had treated her, how the world had treated her. And she kind of became my guide because she wasn't enraged by these situations. And I think there's a healthy perspective that in her era, I don't know that she felt entitled to feel rage, but I think even more importantly, one of the remarkable things about Mary was that she was guided so much by her mother. Even though her mother died giving birth to her, her mother wrote books before Mary was born, and even children's books. And Mary had access to these books. And there's some remarkable passages where it's as if Mary Wollstonecraft is writing directly to her daughter. And we know that Mary was deeply influenced by those books because she carried them around. It's one of the things that attracted her to Percy Shelley was because he was such a huge fan of her mother's writing, and the couple would talk about these things. And I really think that Mary always had an idea that her life was more than just her own. I really felt like she learned from her mother that she had opportunity that other women didn't have, and that she needed to be a part of providing women with more opportunities. And I think that really kept her sane in all the hardship that she faced. I think the other thing that kept her sane and from getting completely bitter was the fact that she was a creator. And I know as a creator, when you live to create, it is healing. It's consuming. It gives you a passion. And obviously this was a young woman who made many sacrifices in order to create. And I think that really informed the person she was. She also had a remarkably loving heart because Percy treated her terribly, and yet she remained in love with him. There's this remarkable thing upon her death. Her son opened up her writing desk, and inside the writing desk was the last poem that Percy had written, and inside that was the charred remains of his heart. And I think that's just as a testament to the fact that her love for Percy, despite all those hardships, remained. And I think when you look at the book she created, it's all about compassion. And she was writing this incredible social criticism of what men in power were doing at the time and what man was doing to its fellow man. And I think it takes an incredibly empathetic heart to even want to create a book like that. So she was a pretty remarkable woman. How she held on to her humanity in the face of all the hardships she faced. She was such a great inspiration and guide to me.
Since we're talking about a woman who famously wrote a novel about a creature assembled from parts, it's only appropriate, I think, that we talk about the assemblage of your book, Mary's Monster. Your narrative consists of 9 parts. Can you talk about the reasoning behind that choice?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. Mary herself buried so many clues about her own life within her book. And I wanted to nod to that. I wanted to subtly do the same things that she had done. If you look at her book, for example, the letters by Walton the Explorer, they start on the day that Mary was conceived. She knows this by reading her father's diary, who her father kept incredible details of every fact of his life. And the letters end on the day of her mother's death, which was also when Mary came into the world. And there's so many things like that. And when Mary herself, when she finished her book, she wrote about in her diary, it was on this March night in the middle of the night, everybody in the house was sleeping, and she felt as if she was staring at the eyes of another prodigy, that of her creatures. And she talked about that, and she talked about the fact that she was about to give birth to another child. That child's incubation was 9 months. It had taken her 9 months to write the book. There were all these parallels that she herself saw with her creature and that of the children that she had given birth to. So I wanted to nod to that idea of life created from death, but also this young woman who is giving birth to these children while she is experiencing all these things that led her to eventually write Frankenstein. And so I tried to build that into the structure of the book because she herself recognized this correlation to 9 months to write the book, 9 months to give birth to a child, and that both of them were so closely entwined. Her baby was born just a couple of weeks after she finished the novel.
You mentioned earlier that Mary's Monster is comprised of free verse poems. Did you find that your prior experiences writing picture books, which are also characterized by an economy of text, prepared you for the challenges of telling Shelley's story in free verse?
Yes, I suppose that I think that's true. I feel like nothing quite prepared me for this book. It was, I'll admit, it was overwhelming. The first year, I think I spent the entire year drawing scenes just to convince myself that I could take this on. But it's true, particularly the economy of the line, getting to the heart of the emotion. The challenge with Mary particularly was to set up the historical background to her life. She was born during the Napoleonic Wars. She witnessed 2 decades of war. And she lived in it's like a slum. There were slaughterhouses and just a block away from this huge prison where she was seeing convicts hanged. And when she was sent away at the age of 14 to live with a family she didn't know, these were Jacobites and they were revolutionists, and what does that mean? And she's put on a mail ship during the war, and there was so much historical stuff I had to, because all of that made her into the person she was. She was a witness to these incredible historical events, and she absorbed them in a way that you can tell she was incredibly empathetic. And so all of these things had meaning to her. So to write that sparingly and also give a young reader who doesn't have a lot of experience with this time period, I guess that's why I say, nothing prepared me for the book. But it's true that I think this book was different perhaps in my hands than in somebody else because of my picture book background. A lot of the times when I'm writing the text, I always am telling myself, trust the image, trust the image. Pull back on the text, let the reader absorb it with the pictures and the writing. And that's a big part of my creativity, is always telling myself, trust my reader, because I do believe that a lot of the story is in her eyes and the way she's looking at you, and the compositions, and you can pull back on the text. You don't need to have the text explain I guess how these things are emotionally relevant to her life. You see how they're emotionally relevant to her life.
Wow. There are several things I'm finding myself thinking right now. And one of them that I just want to comment on is I have told anyone who has been willing to entertain me in talking about this book that I could not believe how much I learned about Mary Shelley and how moved I was by a book written with such little text. I mean, it's amazing to me how much information you're able to convey through the combination of words and pictures. And I want to pick up on a point that you just addressed. Eyes are a really important visual motif in Mary's Monster. In some instances, characters will meet and return the reader's gaze. On other occasions, there's eyes, literal as well as figurative, featuring prominently in the design of backgrounds. In one particularly memorable scene that I'm thinking of, Mary Shelley, who has just lost a child, gazes out very mournfully at the reader at the very same moment that a pair of eyes is shown watching her from the shadows. Can you talk about that design choice and its rhetorical or symbolic importance?
Yes, the image you're mentioning actually was the first image I created for the book.
Really?
Yeah, and I think it started with my deep connection to Mary through her book. When I listened to her book, I was in a place in my life where I was feeling very isolated because I was very ill, and with illness comes isolation. There's no way around it. If you're spending that much time in your bedroom instead of with the real world, you're feeling isolated. And in her book, everybody who reads the book sees something different, but one of the huge foundations of her book is compassion. And we see the compassion because the creature she creates is treated so terribly and turned monstrous, and yet the person writing this story has to be compassionate, because at the end of the day it's Frankenstein, the mad scientist, who is the person inflicting all this harm on his creature, and the creature is brought into this world only wanting to feel connection. And I really wanted to get away from the images of Frankenstein that we've all seen in movies. I wanted to not have this be something we've seen before. And so when I just, shut my eyes to visualize what would you see of this creature, I realized that he was born with an intellect, he was born with a compassion, he was born with this incredible pain and suffering. And I think whenever we look into somebody else's eyes, we see joy, sorrow, our emotions are just so prevalent in our expressions. And so I knew that the expressions would be a really big part of my creativity in bringing her story to life. The image where she has just lost her baby and she's looking straight at the reader. The other thing I was just really startled with was when I read Frankenstein, the only thing that I knew about Mary Shelley was I knew that she wrote Frankenstein, and I had heard the lore that they were all gathered at the Villa d'Ota. Lord Byron had dared everyone to write a ghost story, and that's how this story was hatched. And once I got to know Mary, and once I got to know the text itself of Frankenstein, I was really enraged, because here is this incredibly remarkable young woman who wrote one of the greatest books of all time. It was not the result of a dare. The understanding, the empathy she would have had to have created this book, and also the parallels that you see in her life. I guess I was enraged on her behalf, and I wanted her to have a voice terribly. It's why I wrote the book in first person. But it's also why she, at that moment, she's almost at her breaking point. She's just lost this child. She's run away from home because she's pregnant, and she's in love with a poet, and she has this baby. She doesn't have a family of her own. Her mother died giving birth to her, and she's holding on to the fact that she's going to have this baby, and then the baby dies in her arms. And I wanted her to just look at the reader at that moment, because I wanted readers to feel that connection that I had felt in reading her book. And I think the way to do that is to let Mary herself be looking out at the reader. To me, that hopefully is creating that bond that I felt in reading her work.
In regard to the motif I was just describing of the eyes in the book, a notable exception to that is Mary's stepmother, Mrs. Godwin,
yes,
whose eyes I don't think are ever depicted. They constantly remain obscured by her opaque glasses. Can you talk about your impetus for that choice?
I love that you brought that up. Her stepmother was just like this, archetypal evil stepmother. And I think it actually got cut. I had to be so spare in the text. And the detail of the fact that she wore these green tinted glasses because Robespierre from the French Revolution wore green tinted glasses, and I just absolutely love that detail. And I think, unfortunately, we had to cut the poem because of the length of the book. I had to set up history, but I couldn't take too many sidelines because I really had to, get to the heart of the matter for Mary. But I realized I don't need the poem. I can do it in the art because, yeah, she's like this. The truth of her life was she was in an impossible position herself, the stepmother. She was ostracized by society for having been an unwed mother, and she was straddled to a guy that was in incredible debt. She was the business mind of the family, trying to keep things running, but she was also burdened with these two stepdaughters that she did not feel emotionally attached to, and she was just so rageful. And I almost wanted to dehumanize her because I'm telling Mary's story. The story is through the eyes of Mary. She's not going to see the humanity in her stepmother and see all the things that her stepmother's suffering. She's this, young 14-year-old girl who feels like she's being treated so unfairly, and she was being treated unfairly. So I kind of wanted to, make her stepmother look the way Mary herself would have felt as she was looking at this remarkably angry woman. I mean, she just was constantly running off on Mary, on her father, slapping her, just all these things that I couldn't do every picture that I wanted to do, but just by dehumanizing her expression with those glasses, you kind of get it, that she's just this awful woman.
You do, and she's the one character that you never feel fully attached to in the book. You never fully understand in the book.
Yes, and I think it's because Mary never understood her. Mary never was able to see her as, wow, this struggling businesswoman, this struggling, I don't think Mary could ever, it was the one blind spot of Mary's life, that because they cast her out, she never was able to see her stepmother in this fully rounded, never to have the compassion of the position that her stepmother was in as well. I mean, she was suffering as well.
In illustrating the book, you could have worked conceivably with any number of media, and you settled on black and white watercolors. And the black and white illustrations throughout the book really do an extraordinary job of capturing the aesthetic of the Romantics, specifically the romantic understanding of the sublime power of nature to both create and destroy. Was that something that you were conscious of doing? Can you talk about how you see the sublime figuring in your work?
Yeah, it was very conscious. When the first year that I spent working on the book, I guess I should say the second year. The first year was complete research, but the second year, when I actually was starting to sculpt the book and I was doing paintings, because I start visually, they were not black and white, and they gradually became black and white, but they also became more detailed. They started off with really loose watercolors that were full color, and then I was getting more and more tonal. And I remember about 3 years into the project when the book got acquired, and I was talking with my editor, and we had a very lengthy discussion about whether it should be full color and the cost and the production, and then I think we were talking for about an hour, and then I finally said, I'm not sure why we're discussing this. It has to be black and white. And she said, you're right, it has to be black and white. And I wanted to capture that rich detail of naturalism, and the way, they were dissecting science at the time in a way that no generation had done before them. They were wanting to understand the world, and they were combining like this science with what it was doing to humanity. I mean, one of the most interesting details I thought was the fact that the volcano that had erupted a year before had caused the weather that, the lightning and the storms, and when they're staying at the Villa Diotta and she's conceiving of Frankenstein, you get this, electrifying weather. And I wanted the reader to experience these details in the way Mary Shelley herself was experiencing them, because it wasn't enough for her to live in the life. She wanted to understand life in a way that prior generations hadn't. And Shelley and her were constantly discussing science and astronomy and galvanism and all these things. And so I felt like that the art had to reflect that, that kind of deep understanding. But at the same time, I wanted to feel, like this Gothic time. And I felt like the color would just be getting in the way, that the black and white just like focuses your eye on what I want as a creator to have the eye focus on, rather than having it be full color. I think it would have lessened the emotional impact of the art and been more, scenery based.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I thought that several times as I was reading the book. Could you tell this story in color? Well, you could. Would it have the same impact? I definitely don't think so. I agree with you totally.
Cool.
Mary's monster is ostensibly a biography, but the creature does play an important role in the text. What motivated you to include him as a character in the story?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that one up too. Yes, I debated so long because I wanted this story to be as close to nonfiction as possible, and that I had done all this research and I wanted to speak her truth. And I knew that if I told the story with the creature's voice, I was bumping the book out of nonfiction. But I wanted my readers to understand that this is the truth as closely as I could, understand this girl's real life and what, what she experienced. But at the end of the day, it's also a tribute to her as a creative person. It's not just a straight up biography. It is a testament to creativity. It's a testament to, in all the obstacles she faced, I think it was creativity that got her through. And it was a testament to the book itself, the Frankenstein, the thing that she left us. I wanted readers, particularly young readers, to have a much deeper understanding of Frankenstein, the novel, so that we could understand what this young woman left us. And in order to do that, I felt like I had to tribute different features of the book she created. So we mentioned the 9 chapters to replicate, her understanding of that. But in her book, she broke with tradition by giving 3 different narrators the story. Walton, Frankenstein, and the creature himself all speak. They all tell their story from their own point of view. And that was revolutionary at the time. Novels before were these didactic texts that told you the story. She showed you the story by having her characters speak, and everybody speaks with their own perspective. Frankenstein's view of thing, Dr. Frankenstein, is completely and radically different than the reality of the creature. And so I felt that to tell her story and to give tribute to what she had created, I wanted the creature to have a voice. I also felt that the remarkable thing was she was writing a book about creating life from death, but really she created life from literature. It's 200 years later, we're still talking about her creature. Our culture is deeply influenced by him. And so I wanted him to have a voice because of the legacy that she had created. I felt like that was the only way I could really address that issue.
A crucial decision involved in adapting Mary Shelley's novel into any visual form is obviously going to be, how do you depict the creature? Your version is among the more human looking that we've seen. How did you go about designing him? How did you go about designing your version of the creature?
Yeah, I really wanted to get away from the horror movie, thing. And I just really, really, really went back to the text. And I avoided, anything Frankenstein while I was creating it. People would hear I was working on it and, recommend this movie or that. And I avoided it completely. But the other thing is I not only relied on her text, so anything that she mentioned in the text, I wanted to try to convey in that creature. But the thing that's so amazing about her love for Percy Shelley is that I think one of the reasons she was able to maintain her love for him, despite all the hardship that he threw in her path, was this deep understanding that Shelley was himself persecuted and felt isolated. Here was this incredibly talented young man who was a poet. He wanted to envision a world where people lived a just life, where women could be educated. He had all the right goals in mind. Unfortunately, he was, most likely mentally ill and deeply scarred by the utter rejection of his work. And he was scarred by the rejection by his father for the life that he was living. And it seemed like his own life was unraveling, right before Mary's eyes. And there's some eerie parallels with the creature and Percy. And I think her understanding of how somebody can turn evil through neglect and isolation and cruelty, I think she was witnessing it with a man she loved. And so there is a parallel. I don't want them to look alike, but there's a parallel between the creature and Percy Shelley in the book, particularly in the eyes. And I was going with that understanding when I was creating the look of the creature.
I'm laughing because I think I sometimes have a tendency to read too much in, but you validated me because I was reading the book and going, is he supposed to resemble a little bit Percy Shelley? And I'm like I was flipping pages and I was comparing. Oh, thank you. So I didn't totally read that entire thing in. I feel validated now. My reading feels validated now.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have asked me that before, and I feel like, it's such a burden when you create a biography. You want to get it right. You want to get it right. And I spent 6 years trying to understand this young woman, but I also just kind of trusted the creative process, which is so much of what we create is like what we see and witness and the thoughts we are putting together. And she's writing about this, incredibly high concept of the injury that we do to our fellow man will result in their horrible behavior. And she couldn't have not been influenced by the men in her life, her father and Percy Shelley, and particularly Percy Shelley, because she gave up everything to be with him. So, it just felt right. It just seemed like the way to go when I was creating the work.
I'll push my luck here, talking about reading too much into the work. One of the things that I really deeply appreciate about Mary's Monster is that as much as it's a biography of Mary Shelley, the book also feels to me to be equal parts a meditation on creativity and the act of creating. Is that something that you were conscious of as you worked on the project?
Absolutely. To be honest, my initial intent wasn't to write a biography. It was to write a meditation on creativity. And I think it was because I was so deeply drawn to the fact that this woman, her life story is endlessly fascinating. But even more than that, unlike any male author that you read about in history, this is a girl that faced unbelievable obstacles in order to be a creator. She lived for creativity, and creativity is what got her through all these tragedies. And I felt like it's like the third prong of this story. There's the book that she created, there's her life, but then there's also this act of creating, because I think that I can't think of another person who would be, maybe equal, but not better to understand why do we feel so compelled to create as human beings. And I know it's something in my life that I feel so compelled to create. It's such a huge part of my life. It's my greatest joy. It's my greatest sorrow. It's the thing that makes me get up in the morning. It's the thing that keeps me on the planet. And I just felt so inspired by her power to create, given the fact that it would have been so easy for her to not create, unlike almost any other author who's been published, just because, what she had to go through in order to be an author in her time period, given that she was an unwed teenage young woman. So originally I was going to write just on creativity, but then as I got further along, I realized this woman is so remarkable that, particularly young readers, they need to understand her as a girl also. They need to understand the details of her life. So it kind of became both biography and this emblem to creativity.
Throughout our conversation, you've referenced the health challenges that you were facing in your own life as you worked on this book. And in the book's end matter, you include a note where you credit, and I'll quote it here, an urgent desire to create with having motivated you to fight against your illness and to regain your strength. And that line really struck me. Is that how you experience the need to be creative, as an urgent desire?
Yeah, it's like a hunger. I feel, being on the other side of spending 2 years unable to create, I feel incredibly blessed because During the time that I was listening to Frankenstein, I was being told that I needed to accept that creating was probably not going to be in my, because we couldn't seem to get my immune system under control, and my hands were so affected, and so was my vision. And I was trying to come to terms with it and failing miserably. And instead, I just realized I'm either going to be on the planet as a creator or I'm not. And when I was going through the physical therapy in order to create, I felt so fortunate because I saw a lot of people around me that were trying to, you're pushing through the pain and everything, and it's hard. It's hard going. It's rough going. And I felt like I would save up the energy of my hand so I could write in my journal, like just a paragraph, so I could just get started on this book. And then by the end of the paragraph, my hand was shot, and I'd have to rest it for the rest of the day and ice it and go through all the different treatments that we were doing in order to build up the tendons in my hand again. And I think that I was really fortunate to find Mary's story at that time in my life, because it just made me realize how worth it is to create. I think storytelling it's what makes us human beings. It's what gives us, an understanding of what it is to be alive and how to navigate all the difficulties that come with life. And I just felt so deeply connected to her work, while I was unable to do my own, that it kind of propelled me when I was able to do my own again. And it's made me really savor the art of creating and the richness that brings to life. And when I'm speaking in schools about writing and art, I want kids to be inspired about writing and creating art, but more importantly, I want them to be inspired, period. I want them to live passionate lives with creativity in their life in whatever form that takes, because I think that it's just what makes us human beings. It makes us happier when we have an outlet for that.
Lita, I've got to tell you that with the knowledge now that it took you 6 years to create Mary's Monster, I almost feel like a little bit of a heel to ask this question, but what's next for you? Are there projects you're currently working on that you can talk about or which we can watch for, or are you going to be taking a hiatus?
Oh, never a hiatus. I hope to never take a hiatus again. No, I've got some projects I'm really excited about. I have a book called When You Need Wings, which is a story that I think it's taken my whole life to understand well enough to write, but it's a book for very young kids, and it's kind of about the power of quiet. It's about being kind of a shy, introverted kid who's forced into the extroverted world of school, and the character in this story is feeling, really out of place and in conflict with what's around her, and then she just looks inward and takes a moment, and the imaginative, it's about creating. She looks inward and she goes to a place that she needs to go to kind of collect herself. And this beautiful, fantastical world unfolds for her. And then she finds her power within that. And then she's kind of ready to embrace the world around her. So that's a book I'm working on. And then I'm also working on nonfiction books about the planet and animals. I have a book called Born in the Wild, which is about how animals raise their young. And then I did a book called Homes in the Wild about how they build their shelters. And the third book in the series is called Play in the Wild, and how they play and what they learn through play. It's based on scientific fact. It's not just like what we think they learn through play. It's what we've been able to glean. Like, this is the behavior that we learn through this kind of play. And, my goal is, I think a lot of kids don't get to live the life that I was fortunate to live. And our planet needs help. It needs stewards. And I feel like as a creator, it's part of your job is to raise the next generation of kids to have empathy. And in my case, I want them to have empathy for the planet and empathy for the other inhabitants of the planet. And so that's why I write a lot of nonfiction books about animals. I've got a book about trees coming up, and I'll always write about the natural world for as long as I'm writing.
Well, I just want to congratulate you. All the accolades that Mary's Monster is getting are so well deserved. And I can honestly tell you, I don't think I've been as emotionally impacted by a book in a long, long time as I was with this book.
Wow, thank you.
And thank you for taking time to talk with me. This has been an incredible conversation. I've so enjoyed it.
I have too. Thanks a lot. It's wonderful to share creativity with you and your podcast, and it's been a real treat for me.
That's our show for this month. Thanks again to Lita for making time to talk with me, and thank you for being here and listening. If you haven't read Mary's Monster, there's still time to add it to your holiday wish list. And with winter upon us, you've got a built-in excuse to stay inside where it's warm and catch up on some reading. I look forward to seeing you back here in the new year when we'll continue to talk about the craft of storytelling. Till then, happy holidays!